I could handle the brain works for both of us.
A space adventurer looks for 3 survivors on a quarantined colony planet that's under the metal thumb of Overdog. Now, Overdog is not, repeat, not a good boy. Along the way, the adventurer picks up a fast-talking space urchin and a work rival, and all of this is in 3D. Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone.
Because without me, you ain't gonna find him in Melonium.
A Melonium?
Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone was a 1983 science fiction themed action-adventure movie where the easiest and simplest way to describe it is as Han Solo meets Mad Max. It was originally made in 3D and opened in the US a week before Return of the Jedi, where, as it turns out, Space Hunter's box office returns were disappointing for Columbia Studios. A disappointment on the level of a concert goer hearing the words, "We'd like to play a selection of songs from our new album. Also, the exits have been locked and barred."
Are they missing any limbs? I hate it when they have missing limbs.
It's possible that you perhaps never heard of this film, and that's probably down to its release timing. But the thing is, it is a pity because Space Hunter is a lot of fun, and in general is pretty good, without a lot of the messy acting and poor staging that a lot of these lower budgeted films with space and wasteland settings often have. Here, the cast is strong and the story hustles along nicely. Well, it would want to, because this is not a long film, clocking in at around an hour and a half, which for those with short attention spans is... I like that Jeep thing. A space disaster on a sightseeing cruise has only 3 survivors, whose ejection capsule leads them to the nearest habitable planet. Now, here is where we have to contest the meaning of habitable, since Terra 11 is one of those planets where things have not gone so well.
Smells like somebody died in here.
It's an old Earth colony where things went south after a deadly plague and the entire planet was quarantined.
Plague's been running rampant since 2031. Sounds great.
However, the 3 survivors are lovely ladies, and so the reward for rescuing them is rather high. It's worth it just so long as you ignore the fact that Terra 11 is not the best place to build a day spa, and the nearest IKEA is 3 star systems away. So take the interplanetary 4 for 3 AUs and then take a left at the asteroid field. Wolf is a former soldier and now a bit of a fortune hunter, where his main gig seems salvage. He takes the potentially lucrative job of retrieving the survivors along with his engineer Chalmers, who's a super sophisticated android, but there's clearly a droids with benefit type deal between her and Wolf. On the planet, the pair begin their search in their RV, the Scrambler, but quickly they find a train where some locals have found the survivors, but they're under attack from some other locals who in the end manage to snatch up the 3 women. Chalmers has also been killed, where Wolf reminisces about all the good times with her and then just sets her to decompose there and then. It's just so touching. Though it is interesting to think about that in the future where people may have their own sex-capable robots in their homes, whether people will just treat them like smartphones and stick the obsolete one in a drawer when they get an upgrade, or whether they just give the old one to their kids without thinking it through. The planet's ruler, Overdog, has the 3 survivors brought to him. Now, just to get this out of the way, he's not a dog, but he is a hound.
Undress her.
Overdog is part man, but mostly machine, which means he needs living energy to survive, which he gets from taking it from more vital humans such as the 3 women. So, look, he really is a man of the people.
You better not skizz my home or I'll get my father to split your face. And I got brothers too.
Wolf meets Nikki, a local urchin whose command of the planet's vernacular is impressive to say the least. Though this being a movie, it doesn't take long before she's forcibly bathed by Wolf, since if you cast Molly Ringwald, you ideally want to see Molly Ringwald. Nikki is a fast talker who explains the planet's layout, but in a way that has so much local slang that you'd think you'd stumbled into a TikTok video played backwards and at double speed.
I tracked you to the zone and then you pick up those Earth frollies and then so long, Nikki.
She thinks of herself as Wolf's business partner. He thinks of her as a used tourist guidebook that somebody's left behind on the bus, which he intends to discard once he's done.
Don't drive too close to the cliffs because they'll whack you straight. Are we gonna eat soon?
No.
There's also Wolf's rival, Washington, who's still a serving officer, but needs Wolf's help to get the survivors off the planet.
You're like fly shit on the window. First little breeze that blows and you're gone.
Wolf is he's a loner, and he's already got a partner in this job, so no deal. Of course, Wolf and Nikki end up taking a few wrong turns before finding out that Terra 11 is a really special sort of sandy and dusty hole in space. There's a lake, but it's poison, so that planet has that high potential for dehydration. But then, that's what they said about Tatooine, Klendathu, and all of the other holiday destinations sponsored by Gatorade. Washington rescues Wolf and Nikki, and together the trio head for Overdog's lair. Overdog's lair contains an obstacle course into which people who displease him are thrown. None survive, but if they were to survive, hypothetically, they've been guaranteed freedom by Overdog. Nikki is captured and it's her turn to run the gauntlet. It's part Gladiators or Ninja Warriors and part Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, though the makers of this film could probably sue either. Nikki, being all sorts of nimble, manages to survive the course, but Overdog, being as trustworthy as a certificate of authenticity on a cube of Bringles, means that she's the next victim of his life-sucking machine, which is in no way related to another life-sucking machine. Overdog is defeated, everybody goes home, and Nikki's found a new buddy, or a new daddy, or a new daddy buddy, or a dadabity.
Blast them now and get to know them later.
Just relax.
Space Hunter Adventures in the Forbidden Zone was one of those 80s films that you either remember or you didn't. If you don't remember it, it's not because the film is poorly cast or forgettable, it's more that your mind was probably on other things at the time. As we said earlier, it's set in the future. It has a few scenes set in space, but for the most part, there's not a lot to distinguish this from the plethora of 80s Mad Max style films set in a desert wasteland with regressed societies using cobbled together clothing and technology.
So you're real lucky I'm here. Real lucky, that's all I gotta say.
If that's all you got to say, then I am lucky.
This is a pretty good film, and unlike so many Mad Max clones, it's not made with a budget smaller than a Dashin's jump height. I mean, they were making Star Trek movies for this sort of money, but direct-to-video producers could pump out 3 or 4, and probably more movies for the same amount of money. The pacing of the movie is one of its biggest strengths. It's only 90 minutes, so it sets up the basics without reams of exposition or narration or flashbacks. Wolf is a bit of a rogue, but not a lot of a rogue. He does his own thing. The trouble on the planet and the reasons for its present state are explained in a few lines of dialogue, and it's all very efficient. It's an economy test in movie form. For films with action done well, the test, well, for me at least, is whether the bits in between the action are done well. Can the actors actually act as well as they can throw a punch? Is the dialogue worth listening to? When the answer is yes to those questions, yes, then I'm, well, personally, way more interested in a film like this.
Hot dogs.
I thought Earthers were supposed to eat good.
It isn't a dog. They just call it that.
Space Hunter doesn't do anything outstandingly original, but what it does do reasonably well.
I love your planet.
Space Hunter was one of the few films looking to cash in on a very brief early 80s flirtation with 3D movies. In 1981, the Western film Coming At Ya kickstarted interest in 3D movies using a relatively new process where instead of the traditional red and blue, new glasses had polarizing lenses, and they basically just look like paper sunglasses. So now you could also pretend you were cool while going cross-eyed. Space Hunter's use of 3D isn't all that over the top, it's a lot of people pointing things at the camera. So perhaps we should be very thankful that it's a PG-rated movie.
I'm glad you noticed.
Space Hunter had a fairly modest budget of between $12 and $15 million, depending on which set of books forensic accountants were looking at, but it also barely squeaked past that number in terms of its US box office take, which seems like the sort of result that no studio looks at and says, hey, there's a sequel in that. It opened a week before Return of the Jedi, which may have seemed like a brave move at the time or trying to cash in for the hype for that movie, but in hindsight, that does feel like a bit of an own goal. The script was in flux all through shooting, and fairly early on, the director and a few others were let go by Columbia when things were not going all that well. Veteran director Lamont Johnson, who had mostly worked on television along with a few features, stepped in to get the film done.
You help me out, I make it worth your while. You probably come out of this with at least 500 meg.
Some relationships in the movie were changed. The character of Wolf veered between grouchy and paternal.
I'm going in.
On whose side?
My side. Cover me.
Peter Strauss had had a long career, mainly on television as a leading man and later character actor, though he was generally not known at the time for appearing in lighter fare. I do think he does a solid job as a Harrison Ford stand-in, so just as long as he doesn't horribly injure himself during the shoot, things should be just peachy.
This is going to be easier than I thought.
Molly Ringwald was 15 when this was released, and this was just before she began her reign as the queen of John Hughes' 80s teen movies. In the film, she reels off pages and pages of sci-fi style patois and somehow made it seem like it was the most natural thing in the world to say.
Got any joint smoke on you? It's been a long, dry day.
Other actors in the cast saying similar sorts of lines do not manage it half as well as Ringwald, and the film mainly works because of the on-screen dynamics between Ringwald and Peter Strauss. Washington is the more official and respectable version of Wolf, but he still needs Wolf's help.
It could happen to anybody.
Ernie Hudson had been working steadily in television and smaller films, where this film was of course released a year before one of Hudson's most iconic roles in Ghostbusters. Speaking of which, Ghostbusters director Ivan Reitman was an executive producer on this, and Harold Ramis provides an uncredited voiceover at the start.
And the police called from the 42 sector. You got 105 parking tickets. I think you should take care of that.
And then there's Michael Ironside, who's famous or infamous from Scanners, where here he does an excellent job as the half-man, half-machine, all-evil overdog.
But you said if I made it through, I'm free!
I lied.
If you ever needed somebody to bite your head off, hire Michael Ironside. Singer and actress Andrea Markovici appeared as a guest on many action shows in the late 70s and 80s, from Incredible Hulk to Magnum and beyond. Oh, and one of the survivors was Deborah Pratt, who'd appear in Airwolf and Quantum Leap and would later go on to become a writer and producer.
That way.
Veteran composer Elmer Bernstein provided a rousing space adventure score for a film in a genre that normally would have had the music budget just enough for one dude with a synth and a borrowed drum machine. Space Hunter feels bigger than the sum of its parts.
You're becoming a real philosopher.
The production design and costumes sell the failed and regressed colony, and the action in this is generally well staged. Some of the model work and mats don't have the same level of polish as an ILM production, but for the scale of the film, they work okay. On the other hand, the practical effects work, and stunts are very nicely handled.
Will you please shut up?
For some people, Space Hunter is sort of infamous for an effect shot in some versions of the movie, where there's a parking lot still in vision, either on a work print or a VHS version. Though as far as I can tell, it's not visible in the widescreen versions in circulation today. The simplest explanation, the movie was shot on 35mm cameras and framed in the 1.85:1 aspect ratio, where the black bars were added for a theatrical release, but not added for the TV and video versions, which occasionally meant you would see stuff at home that you weren't meant to see. Usually it's just something like a boom mic, but now you're getting a parking lot, so that's added value. So if you can see it, leave a comment and tell us where. I do remember looking for it on the rental versions decades ago, but I don't remember if I ever actually found the parking lot. I do vaguely recall seeing this in 3D in a theatre at the time.
But scabs are no problem. It's the zoners you gotta watch out for. They're bad luck for you.
But ever since, it's been a strictly 2D affair for me, where, apart from a few telltale shots of people pointing things at the camera, it doesn't feel like the 3D gimmicks were all that obnoxious. I mean, gimmicks can be totally obnoxious, like the time, insert story about made-up relative here or people at the office. That and the lack of proofreading really grinds my gears. Space Hunter wasn't mind-blowing, but it's a lot of fun, and it's mostly well made with a cast that elevates this far beyond so many 80s films set in the future after a war where people drive cars with lots of spiky bits welded on. The real tragedy of Space Hunter is that the bones were there for a series of small to medium budget adventures, but its failure at the box office meant that we'd have to be content with this as a one and done. If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
In case I forgot to tell you, this thing doesn't float.